Why is violence against women in politics a threat to democracy itself and not only a gender-based problem?
Thanks, Clara. Look, all violence against women is bad and must be stopped. Violence against women is a human rights abuse, full stop. But the violence that women in politics face has more layers, two more layers at least. First of all, it is an abuse of their civil and political rights. And thirdly, it undermines democracy. Why does it undermine democracy? Because it impacts the participation of 50% of the population, every population around the world. So that's why it's important to focus on this, not only as a human rights and a gender problem, but also as a democracy issue. Also, these days, we know that this violence is what we're calling more than mean. It's more than just base misogyny. It is being used by authoritarians and illiberals as a deliberate political tactic. It's part of political strategy, and it is aimed at all women, and particularly at those who are confronting power and confronting abuse and confronting corruption. So that's why this is more than a human rights issue. It is also an issue of democracy.
What keeps us today from gender equality in politics? And do you believe that if nothing changes at all, we'll ever get there to this equality, or something, or what has to change before that?
Thank you for that question. According to the Global Gender Gap 2020 report published by the World Economic Forum, at the current rate of progress, in order to close the gender gap in politics and economy and health and in education, it's going to take another 99.5 years. So clearly, we're still facing many barriers to achieving gender equality. And those barriers are at the individual level, they're at the institutional level, and at the social cultural level. At the individual level, as women, we never believe we are ever qualified enough, right? We always have to be more prepared than the men to run for office. At the institutional level, like political organizations, so parties or legislators, that's a very unwelcoming culture for female colleagues. They replicate the machista culture in Latin America. And at the social cultural level, the representation by the media of women in leadership still tends to focus on what we're wearing or on our marital status, as opposed to our policy positions and competence. The National Democratic Institute, we believe that in order for things to change, more women have to get involved in politics. And it comes from the belief, as Sandra said, that democracies require that political systems and processes take into account the voice and agency of all populations, particularly more than 50% of the world's population of women. And this participation has to mean that we have an equal say in decision making that affects our lives and our communities, and it's both a rights issue and an issue of democratic integrity. As our beloved chairwoman, the late Madeleine Albright, said, that the only way for things to change, particularly to end violence against women in politics, is for women to participate in politics.
And how can we better facilitate and safeguard women's political participation around the world?
No, as Deborah said, we have to take action at all sorts of levels. The individual has to be prepared. We work with fabulous groups called Elect Her or Ready to Run or Running Start that focuses on young girls and getting them ready. So that's at individual level. And then there are a whole lot of intervening institutions, political parties. They are the gatekeepers for participation, for new members, for women, for a broader spectrum. And political parties are very problematic for women's health and safety, let alone for their political ambitions. We've done a study on violence against women within their own political parties, which we call protected public spaces, because it's very seldom that any of us get at the ability to reform those if you're standing outside. Things that go on within political parties are illegal outside those parties in the same jurisdictions. So political parties are very challenging spaces and really needing a lot of reform. And then, as Deborah said, we have to deal with the fact that our sociocultural environment is rooted in gender inequality. And we all grow up in that environment. That we want and we anticipate that the progress has to be made more progress will be made when men join the struggle, because it's being carried by women by themselves for far too long. And after all, the reality is that taking just one measure of political empowerment, we are stuck at a global representation rate for women in parliaments at 26%. That means 74% of all parliamentarians are male. And when you cut it also for age, most of those parliamentarians are over the age of 50. In fact, young women, that's women under 30, represent less than 2% of all the parliamentarians in the world. And that's in a world where we know that in most parts of it, there is a youth explosion. So this business about how the political space has been captured by men, and frankly, they're not going to release their hold on it easily, that is a core thing. This privilege is inbuilt. I always say that politics is a sort of a temple to masculinities. And when you want to change it, you have to understand that that change will cause disturbance and turbulence across many different spectrums of our lives, because you're challenging that first privilege, and that privilege is a powerful tool that those who have it don't want to release.
Of course. Thank you, Sandra. Just out of curiosity, in Brazil, I don't know if you know, but we have a law that says that 30% of the postulations of the candidates have to be female. It's been a few years, and the idea is to promote more participation of women in politics. Do you have that in the U.S. or in countries? Would you know if there's something similar? By law, I mean.
Not in the U.S. And I think, and Deborah will know this better than I do, being a citizen, but there is, culturally, quotas don't sit well in the sociocultural landscape of the United States. But the great strides and increase that women have made into parliaments and into politics over the last 20 years have mainly been because nearly 80 countries have actually introduced quotas of some kind. Now, I'm going to be a little bit controversial because I'm supposed to be very pro-quota. I am, except that they're failing. 49% of those quotas don't actually even meet their numerical targets, let alone do what they're supposed to do, because they're called temporary special measures. They are supposed to catalyze women into a self-sustaining dynamic of political participation and representation. They don't do that. And that label at the front end, the temporary piece, there's never yet been a quota that's been sunsetted. So we need to think hard about how do we make these quotas work, and work in ways that don't actually attract more backlash than they attract support. So a little bit controversial there on quotas, but that is the reality. That's what the research shows us.
And if I can chime in on that.
Please do.
Clara, what we saw in Honduras, that has its first woman president, who is also the most voted candidate ever in their history. In fact, her coming into power didn't mean more women coming into power. There is less representation now at the national level and at the municipal level. And what we have found with the quotas, the mandate is that the men in power have found ways to work around. So yes, in the primary system in Honduras, there are primaries, and they are required to put forth 30% of women at the primaries. but that's it. Then going into after the primaries, if they're not voted, women have tended not to be at the top of the lists. They're at the bottom of the list, or in positions that the men know the women will not be able to make it into power. We've seen that at the municipal level, where women can get into power at vice alcaldesas, which means they have no power when they're in council. And so there have also been, this backlash has also been visible in the workarounds that we've seen on the quota systems.
To build on Deborah's point there, because I know that in some parts of the region, you also have this process whereby women are actually in some places coerced into stepping down in order for the next male on the list to take their place. This is a huge abuse of voters' rights. So there are lots of ways in which this violence has very deleterious kind of impacts on democracy.
Yes, of course. And what we see in Brazil is that we have 30% of female candidates, but they don't have as much access to the fundings for their campaigns as their male counterparts. So they have much more or less. There's an inequality in the distribution of the fundings. What to say to women who give up on the dream of having a political career because they're afraid of violence and exposure on social media?
Well, we would say carry on, right? There are steps to take and communities to join, not to prevent the violence, but to help mitigate some of the risks. And NDI and others are there to accompany the women in their journey. And many examples of online violence include gender disinformation and misogyny. Online violence against women, as Sandra has said before, represents a direct barrier to the freedom of expression and the women's right to choose and be chosen at the ballots. This undermines democracy in all of its key elements, with negative effects on the aspirations of women, particularly young women and new participants in politics. The threat of violence and inaction of social media companies to do anything about this has caused women to silence themselves and not pursue public office. And NDI has been working with several technology platforms in the region in Latin America, including Meta, as well as with election commissions to produce guides and resources for women in order to overcome but also denounce the online violence. And examples of this where NDI has worked in the region include Colombia and Mexico, working with both the election commissions and the social media platforms to either take down disinformation about women or have election commissions sanction others, political parties and candidates, for doing so.